Hello to this video. So it's a day, another lovely summer's day, a little cooler than it has been recently, but we've all been enjoying the sunshine. And this time of year always puts me in mind, in terms of listening of some of the great British recordings, and particularly the folk rock, golden age of folk rock, as I call it, that sort of existed between the late 60s and 1975. Um, this really centers around two bands. One that I really want to look at today, Fairport Convention, um, that really pushed this new form of music forward. And for a few years, it's very popular. And it's again come around in popularity. It never goes away. But in terms of its creative apex, I suppose these years would be the ones where some of the most noticeable and classic records of the genre sort of emanate from. And it obviously, the folk revival, folk boom in Britain of the 50s and 60s is the backdrop to it. But by the late 1960s, something else is happening, and as rock music in this country is progressing at a rapid rate. Um, Obviously, re-importing itself to or exporting into America, but also drawing from that. And what you get around this time in '68 is the first album coming from America, is the first album by the band Music from Big Pink, who give up the urban living and move to a house in near Woodstock in upstate New York, make music communally, and really tap back into their American roots, or attempt to do so, and fuse that with music that they're the music that they're making now with rock instrumentation, but dig back into something of the old storytelling and folk and country traditions, as well as the blues that they really feel that they want to engage with. Now, the influence on that over here comes particularly on bands like Traffic, but really in Fairport Convention. I mean, Richard Thompson, the guitarist at the time, who's, you know, fantastic solo artist. Now, really groundbreaking guitarist, very original style. Said in this era, we didn't want to really be a second-rate Otis Redding or Muddy Waters. There were bands obviously doing that and doing that very well, and we didn't. And while they'd taken their cue from sort of American West Coast psychedelia and Jefferson Airplane and bands like that, after a really horrible car crash where the band's drummer died, and Rich Thompson's girlfriend was killed, they had to regroup, and they set off to Winchester, or very near Winchester in Hampshire, to a small village called Farley Chamberlain, to make the record that would become obviously the pivotal folk rock album, which was Legend Leaf. And in doing so, they took along with them Dave Swarbrick, who had played with Martin Carthy and who was very well known on the traditional folk scene, to make this record, and tapped into British roots. Ashley Hutchins, the bass player, had later formed Steel Eye Span, go to Cecil Sharp House in London, look for old folk song and old lyrics and tunes, and then mold that with a rock instrumentation, which had not been done before at all in terms of bringing British folk music to that, and therefore really forming a new genre that, as I said, bands like Steel Eye Span would get involved with a year or so later, and then it would dovetail out. People like John Martin, that came from the folk scene, would get involved and take it and stamp their own individuality on it. But Fairport's sort of possibly the leading exponents of the style, and definitely with their musicianship. They folk rock records that from that era, people like Shirley Collins used them on her record No Roses in 1972, their rhythm section of Dave Mattox, particularly, and Dave Pegg were, later on in the 70s, was really, something that was called on when you really wanted to make a good folk rock record with a really deep sort of rural groove to it, that sort of is influenced by American music, but again, as I say, brings out this British side of and therefore, you know, a new style, something that was really original. Um, Last year, I wrote a piece, top 10 of British folk rock records, and brought a variety of acts in there. But obviously, Fairport, well, no spoiler alert, sat at the top with the Legion Leave record. Um, Pivotal to this, prior to this, the records they made their debut album with their first album with just called Fairport Convention, and had the singer Judy Dybel on it, who later would lead to and would join the band Renaissance. And Sandy Denny, the legendary British folk singer, joined as part of from the folk boom for the next record, What We Did on Our Holidays, and the album On a Half Bricking, which featured the traditional tune that Sandy had brought in called Sailor's Life. And this is the first to feature Dave Swarbrick. And what you hear at the end of that record, after they've actually gone through the song as it builds, is an improvisation between the band, particularly featuring Swarbrick and Richard Thompson on guitar, that sort of brings sort of some of that West Coast vibe, some of the sort of Grateful Dead improvisation, but brings it into the realm of British folk music, and that's what they built on for Legion Leaf, which is, as I said, the pivotal record in this, and considered the Fairport's sort of their finest moment. However, I want to look at a few of their other records over the years, because they continue to make some really great stuff. And I mean, I first saw them in an 80s iteration of 1988 when I was 14. So it was the lineup with Simon Nicol and Dave Pegg, Martin Alcock on guitar at the time, Dave Mattox was there in the early days on drums, and that was it was still a really great show. I mean, they would still continue to make their own material, record albums, and were not shy about using 80s technology and stuff at the time in there, covering other songs. They weren't great writers by that point, so they covered other songs. And obviously live, they brought in the classics as well. And it gave me back in the 1980s, the tail end of the Thatcher years, it gave you something that was, you know, tangible and was a connection to the past. And I went out and delved into the records and found what I could in that era, cassettes, I think, at first, and then CDs, and some of the titles were deleted, and the newer stuff was available when you could still get some of the old classics if you waited enough. So I dug back into, before Legion Leaf, I don't the albums, those the Unhalf Bricking, as I mentioned, and What We Did on Our Holidays. But it's, as in terms of the real British folk rock, it's what led after that that's interesting. The band for the album Full House, which is coming up to its anniversary at the end of this month, was released in 1970 after Sandy Denny and Ashley Hutchins, the original bass player, had left. Ashley Hutchins had gone on to form Steel Eye Span. Sandy Denny went on to form Fotheringay and then launch her own solo career. And you can really hear the band stretch out instrumentally on that record as well. And things like Sloth, which is a long 12-minute sort of battle epic, is just hauntingly beautiful. Again, with great stretches of improvisation between Swarbrick and Thompson on that one. There's stuff based on traditional tunes in there, some you know, some things gathered together in medleys, but the original stuff really stands out. And with the reissue years later that included track was left off called Paul Will and the Jolly Hangman. There's some really dark stuff. Richard Thompson's writing, Swarbrick's writing on this is, in particular, is, and the collaboration between them is fantastic. And Full House is a really recommended album. At the time, they moved from the house they rented in Hampshire to a place in Hertfordshire, but the Angel, an old disused pub. The next album, 1971, and they're constantly going through lineup changes. Richard Thompson would leave to launch his own solo career. Angel Delight features some great writing performances, but by this time they're down to a sound four-piece with Simon Nicol attempting lead guitar duties, and then the concept album Babcom Lee, based around the man they couldn't hang, went to the gallows on a sort of false charge down in Babcombe, Devon. And each time it failed, he failed to hang, and it's the concept album based around the story of that from some old newspapers that Swarbrick had found in a second-hand or antique shop somewhere. That's a very interesting album as well. Perhaps not in the classic league, but certainly something as in terms of a folk rock concept album that's pretty innovative for 1972. Moving from that, it sort of all falls apart. Mattox and Nichols leaving only Swarbrick and Dave Pegg. But they reconvene with Trevor Lucas, who was soon to marry Sandy Denny, and the American guitarist Jerry Donahue, and did the albums Rosie and Nine, which were particularly strong records. And we can really see the fusion of American influence of Jerry Donahue's electric guitar, sort of country influenced electric guitar work against this traditional folk material. Sandy Denny would rejoin in 1975 for the Rising for the Moon album, which was produced by Glyn Johns, seen as their last great home, that really missing out on, and all of this time sort of commercial and a commercial breakthrough. And Rising for the Moon was seen as a push towards that, and it takes off some of the rough edges. Some sounds a bit 70s, more country rock standard, but Sandy Denny's compositions are really solid on that record, and that's one that I recommend, one that I first found in a family friend's record collection. Has got a great sleeve to it, and then sat on the cover around the table and bathed in moonlight, looking, and this drawing looking like a sort of raggle-taggle bunch of gypsies enjoying a good time. It's a one worth exploring. The expanded set comes with a live concert in America from the time in 1974, which really shows how great they were live. Sandy Denny, Trevor Lucas, Jerry Donahue sort of leave after that. Simon Nicol comes back, and there's some late 70s albums like Tippler's Tale and the Bonnie Bunch of Roses, which are interesting, that continue the folk rock sound by, but this time the sort of classic era of the Magic has somewhat dissipated. There are some fan favourites on there, and they sort of fold in 79, but within that get the idea to do a reform at the Oxford Village of Cropsey each year, which has become a very big annual event. And later on in the 1980s, they reformed with a new lineup: Rick Sanders and Martin Alcock, as I mentioned, on guitar, Rick Sanders on violin, who came and played with Soft Machine and somewhat sort of jazz background. And they released some quite strong albums in that era. An all-instrumental album called Expletive Delighted, I think it's called. There's Gladys's Leap, albums like Red and Gold. And then they continue on into the 90s, making some solid stuff while doing their annual reunion and doing a winter tour at the same time, which I'd seen them on several times, bringing it sort of like to provincial theatres and spreading the word, as it were. I mean, you could never be fed up after a Fairport convention concert. There was always something there that sort of was uplifting and none too heavy, though the musicianship and the presentation was extremely good, and they continue to this day. I mean, they're all, as we all are, getting on a bit now, but they continue to do it. And the musicians, it's fine. Every year they think of new guests for property. People like Richard Thompson come back. They've done classic albums. They've redone Legend Leaf on its anniversary. They've done Full House. It's a great catalogue to try and to explore. And with the internet out there, all of this stuff is available. I really need to complete an article soon. I was going to write about them as a guide to how to buy this stuff. But as a beginning of talking, I shall do a few videos on folk rock, and that this is a good place to start, and then we can dig deeper back into people like Steel Span and look at the people that sort of were off piste from this but can come from it. People like John Martin. That's going to be an interesting one. And also bands like Traffic That Life as well. All this British music, it's here. It's great. It comes out of this huge firmament, this huge burst of creativity that you see in Britain at the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s. And some of our finest music is made there, and it's a connection. It's a connection to our roots as well. It fuses the influences that we bring in from America and our own folk heritage as well. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and look out for some Fairport Convention. I'll post the links below to things that I've written on this already, and continue soon. Thank you very much. Goodbye for now.